So with that, let me introduce Alex. Alex is a chartered engineer. She is a fellow of the Institution of Civil Engineers, a fellow of the Chartered Institution of Highways and Transportation, and a member of the Register of Security Engineers and Specialists. She has a wealth of experience in issues pertaining to asset management, BIM, digital built environments, intelligent transport systems, management of information and security-minded approaches. Accumulating expertise through several engineering roles, Alex specializes in the development, implementation, management, and auditing of proportionate and structured management systems, policies, and processes, as well as the development and delivery of programs within these disciplines. She is currently joint policy lead for the National Twin Program, which is why she is joining us today. Over to Alex.
Yes, we're good to go. Right, okay, so thank you very much indeed for the opportunity to speak today. So as Ian said, I'm here to talk about the National Digital Twin Programme. So really just to give you a bit of an overview as to what we've been doing with the programme since we brought it back into government to be run directly out of the department, and what the future look is like for the programme, so the work that we're doing and how that is going to be progressing, certainly over the next couple of years, which is as far as we've got funding at the moment. We'll obviously be bidding for more funding at next comprehensive spending review, whenever that is. So I think really National Digital Twin Programme is you're probably familiar, has been sort of born really initially out of the BIM Level 3 programme. Which was really around recognising that if we are going to be able to move the built environment forward, what we need to be able to do is to far better be able to share information across organisations and across sectors within the built environment. That was then followed up in 2017 by the National Infrastructure Commission's report, Data for the Public Good, which was where the idea really of the National Digital Twin Programme was first really, I suppose, articulated in a document the government then responded to. And again, I mean, that was really about reiterating the value of having, excuse me, an ecosystem of multi-domain, multi-sectorial digital twins, with those needing to be connected by securely shared interoperable information of a known quality. So I think the problem comes is then, well, okay, that's a great idea, but how do we actually get there? And we have spent quite a lot of time talking about the vision of this and what the benefits will be when we'll be able to have not only individual digital twins that are trusted, secure, and resilient, but actually also when we'll be able to start connecting those together into a larger ecosystem. And the problem is when we start talking about this, we start to get into fairly wild and wacky ideas. So you see lots of images like this around, and people get very carried away about, well, I've been doing digital twins for 40 years and, this is all going to be wonderful and we'll be able to connect all these things up and wonderful things will happen and, probably world peace will be solved, etc. And I think that's quite a frightening concept for a lot of people. I think that is this idea of everything being connected up this easily is very, very far off. That doesn't mean that there aren't going to be significant benefits that we can actually achieve along the way by increasing people's abilities in these spaces and allowing them to move at a pace at which they themselves feel comfortable. The other problem that we get is when you start talking about these big concepts, we end up with a sort of idea that, well, now the only thing you're going to need to do in order to achieve this utopian ideal is change everything that you do, change all your existing systems, manage all your data very differently. And again, that is very, very off-putting and probably completely unscalable and unadoptable for the vast majority of organisations, certainly within the public sector. People who are sort of local authorities who are trying to deliver real benefit to people, very often with extremely limited resource, very limited technical capability. And that's not to knock what they're doing at all, but recognising that they are facing real challenges and they are managing situations, particularly people like local resilience teams are managing situations on a day-by-day basis. And they don't have, and they're doing that at the moment with very low technical capability and resource. And therefore, when you start talking about this well, you're going to have to change all of these things. Nobody's ever going to do that, and the costs are too high. So what we've had to do really is to look and say, well, okay, if we want to get to this position ultimately where we are able to connect digital twins, how are we actually going to do that? Where are we now? Where do we want to be? And what is the path that we're going to have to go to get there? And what do we need to do in order to allow people to come along that path at a pace at which they themselves feel comfortable? So we've really gone back and looked at, well, what is important? And we've got things like the Gemini principles, which I think probably were a little bit of a mix up between the principles about how you would run a national digital twin and then and how you would run a program versus, well, actually, what would digital twins themselves, what properties would they need to have, what principles would they need to comply with? And so what we talk about is the National Digital Twin Program being really acting as a focal point for growing national capability in digital twinning as set out in the 2021 Integrated Review. And the way that we run the programme has to comply with certain principles. And then the programme then exists to create the underpinning rules of the road. So the standards, the framework, the guidance, the processes and the tools that will then enable people to develop digital twins and to be able to connect to them together in a way that complies with a second set of principles. So when we talk about the principles of the programme, we talk about some very key things. So the fact that what we need to be able to do is to demonstrate value as we go through this process. So it's no good us going to our lords and masters, our ministers, and saying, yes, well, wonderful things will happen. Just keep funding this for 10 years. And at the end of it, everything will be great. That they just don't wear that. So what we have to do is to look and say, actually, how can we show bankable benefits as we go through this process? And actually, that also helps for organizations that are coming on that process with us. We also have to, I think, be much more open and transparent about where we are now and just how far we have to go. We also have to be open and transparent about the maturity of the things that we are developing. And that's been very important in terms of some of the work that you'll be hearing about later around the integration architecture, is when we go and demonstrate that to people, is being very honest about its capabilities at the moment, but where it is going to be. But I think if we promise or try and tell people that we are further along than we are, then that is damaging. You know, we are making good progress with that work as well as a lot of other things. So we've also got to look very much at scalability and adaptability of everything that we're doing as well. So we need to make sure that what we're doing is accessible to a wide range of stakeholders. So again, going back to my point earlier, there's no point if we are only doing this with consideration of those with high technical capability and high technical resource. We have to be thinking about the full gambit of people out there that could actually benefit from being able to have ultimately digital twins and be able to connect those together. We also need lots of organizations to be able to participate in this. So this is not just about those big organizations being able to participate and being able to use this technology. It's also about how do we facilitate the whole range of the supply chain to be able to get involved in this as well, and not leave any part of it behind. So we will always end up with a bit of a tail. But what we need to make sure is we leave enough of the rungs behind that anybody can then come along that path as well and be able to climb up through that level of maturity. So I think those are really important factors that we need to bear in mind about how we develop the programme. We also then, I think, as I mentioned, the sort of principles that we need to think about when we talk about digital twins as well. And what we need to think about is, how do we get digital twins to be safe, secure, trusted, ethical, sustainable, and robust and resilient? And I'm not saying any of those are easy things to do, but those seem to be some of the core principles that when we've been engaging with stakeholders, we hear time and time again. And I think we'll need to look at how we do all of those, and they're not binary measures, but how do we look at how digital twins can be delivered in a way that ensures those requirements are met in a way that is appropriate for the different situations. So I've forgotten I put this slide in. So this is just talking about, sorry, apologies. This is talking about the benefits as I went through about the programme itself. And also just, this isn't just about technology. What we also need to think about is the skills and the cultural change that is going to be required if we are going to get digital twins being accepted and being adopted and used, and that also being the outputs being acceptable to people across business, across governments, individuals, and wider society. So really, I think we can divide, and it's quite a simplification, but I think what we can do is really divide the programme into three or four core streams. So the first of those is how do we ensure people to gather, process, manage, store, and share information? And I'm not going to go into this in huge amounts of detail because you'll be hearing far more about this later from Tellison, who are building the integration architecture for us. But in addition to the work that they're doing, we also need to think about some other things as well. So we always need to start off with digital twin, well, actually, what is the user requirement that I have? And when I understand that user requirement, actually, what data and information do I need in order to answer that requirement? Because what we hear a lot is, well, actually, I'll just go out and collect all the information because I'm sure it'll be useful at some point. Well, obviously, that is probably not a very sustainable solution and comes with its own carbon footprint as well. And what we should be thinking much more about is actually what is the data and information I need? What are the sources of that information? And what sort of quality does that information need to be for the requirement that I have? Understanding that people need different types of quality of information depending on the situation and also depending on how quickly potentially they need to make a decision as well. And this was I think probably a move away from some of the sort of ideas that were set out in the original information management framework, which was a little bit more around if you are going to come and participate in this space, then you need to, before you come and put any data into this system, your data needs to be of a certain quality. And I think, again, that is probably actually not particularly scalable or adoptable because what you're doing is requiring organizations to commit a lot of resource to improve the quality of their information without necessarily being able to demonstrate the immediate benefit for them. And I think we've got evidence that is just far too big a leap. Organizations just understandably are not going to do that. So instead, what we need is better that we can understand the quality of the information and then decide whether that information is fit for the purpose to which we want to be able to put it, which the user wants to be able to put it. And I think when users start to see the value of the information, then they are more likely to themselves start looking at improving the quality of it. So as I said, I'm not going into huge amounts of detail about the integration architecture because you'll be hearing more about this later, but that is a fundamental part about how we be able to bring information together across multiple sources and to be able to do that in a distributed way. So to be able to federate the information or the appropriate information across organizations between individuals within those organizations. So I will, as I said, I won't go into that in any more detail at this stage. So then I think the second stream really is then about, well, if we've got that information, then what do we need to do with that information to enable users to be able to engage with it? So how do we provide and present that information in a way that enables users to make the decisions they need to make when they need to make them? And also, how do we do that to ensure that users understand level of risk and uncertainty in the information and in the modeling that sits on top of it? And again, that's important because understanding risk and uncertainty will determine the decisions that people make and the confidence they will have in those decisions. And they will have different levels of appetite around that depending on when they're trying to make the decision. So if I have to make a decision in the next 5 minutes, my risk appetite is probably going to be quite different than if I have to make a decision in a month. So how do we do that? How do we get users to better understand risk and uncertainty, as I say, both in data and information and in the models that we put on top of that information? And then the third stream is really around then how do we support the development of skills and cultural change? So how do we look at this generation? How do we look at how we do career development? And how do we look at the requirements around the next generation? So really looking at this from both a pull perspective, but from a push perspective as well. So yes, there will be a pull from industry about the skills that are required, but there also will be a push from, hopefully, from students who are enthused in this area and want to look at, well, actually, what careers are there in this and how do they get involved in those careers? So we need to be able to meet the demand, meet that push that's coming from the next generation as well. And that's will be really around how do we support that work? There's a lot of work going on in that space. What are the specifics that we need to focus on? And where do we need to work with others in relation to that? And I know you, Alison, is speaking later about some of the sort of next generation work that that she is doing and that we are looking at in the programme as well, working with her on that. And then really, I suppose, the fourth stream, the last stream in the programme, if we divide it up into these big chunks, is the demonstration programme. And we've recognised that it's really important to be able to not only do all of that underpinning work around technology and around process and around skills, but to then look at, well, all right, what happens when we try and push that into the real world? Knowing that the moment when you bash things up against real life problems, it tends to be when they break. And when things that you thought were going to work out in the way that you thought they were going to work, you find that they don't work out like that. So the demonstration program is really important about testing our ideas and testing and understanding whether we get the value that we anticipate from these. And again, it's really about scaling. So nothing that we have done so far comes close to what I would consider a digital twin to be. And I'm conscious that I have not defined what I consider a digital twin to be, or what the programme or what the department considers a digital twin to be. I think in broad terms, we would always say it has to have a physical component and a digital component, and that it also has to have a two-way flow of information from the physical to the digital and the digital to the physical. And that has to, flow of information actually has to drive benefit. It has to achieve something. Otherwise, it's pointless. Why have it? So that's the way that we define digital twin. I'm conscious there are a lot of definitions of digital twin out there. And I think actually we need to think more about what are the key factors within digital twins rather than going hammer and tongs about trying to agree a definition with absolutely everybody. We need to think about what the key factors are within digital twins and focus more on that and the functionality that users require. So as I say, digital twins, we don't have them in the demonstration program at the moment, but it's very much about, as I said, how do we demonstrate value by increasing the complexity? So we're moving up through some fairly basic digital modelling and starting to push the complexity of that and looking at always understanding, as we increase that complexity, what is the additional value we get back from that? So we've got several demonstrations that I will just run through in a little bit of detail with you, just to give you a bit of an understanding about what we're doing. The demonstration programme, we are largely running on the Isle of Wight. The reason for the Isle of Wight is that obviously it's a bounded ecosystem. So we have everything, or largely everything, that we have on the mainland, but just in smaller scale. But also we have a bunch of service providers who are very much focused around providing those services on the island as well. So islands are quite good ways of testing these sorts of ecosystems for those sorts of reasons. So the first demonstration programme is around retrofit. So this is around looking at domestic properties and energy consumption. So this is really starting to look at how can we use these types of technologies and processes to understand conflict, if you like, between different types of policies. So with retrofit, we have a big push around decarbonisation of people's properties, so improving the energy efficiency of people's properties. But that also has to be balanced against the fact that we know that we have individuals in properties who are suffering poor health because of the conditions that they're living in, and they might not actually be living in the worst properties. So how do we balance those two different requirements and understand if we pull the lever more on one than on the other, how does that actually impact? We also use this demonstrator to really start looking at things like how do we define the user questions? So going and talking to a wide range of stakeholders and understanding actually what is it that they need? What are the problems that they have and how can we meet that need? So really focusing very much on that user requirement. We were then able to take that and those user requirements and understand if that is what we are trying to achieve, what is the information that we need in order to be able to do that? And how does that information then need to be presented to users in a way that is accessible to them, doesn't prevent them with more information than they need, and is suitable for their particular purpose? So that can be the same information just being presented to different stakeholders in different ways. So the providers such as the NHS probably want quite a different interface with that information than potentially the retrofitters on the island do, and potentially a different view again from the one that the council requires. So really starting to understand what those different requirements are, and actually looking at the sorts of time that these sorts of processes take at the moment, that flow of information between the different stakeholders. And actually, how much can you really start to condense that about being able to far better share information and share decisions that are made on that information between those stakeholders? And actually, what the early work has done is to show that you can really condense that down from months down to a matter of potentially days, which clearly has huge time and cost savings. The second demonstrator is looking around asset resilience. And particularly emergency planning and response. This is focused to date around flooding, and it's very much looking at that interconnectivity of assets. And this is a piece of work that Ian has really been leading on for us, taking and I believe we're speaking about it later, but taking the different assets on the island and looking at the interdependencies, criticalities, vulnerabilities between them, and looking at actually how we can present that information to support the local resilience team in how they are better able to plan for and respond to incidents. And I think one thing that's really interesting to understand from this, we get very concerned about the sensitivity of information, and rightly so, but I think this really just exposed how much information is already in the open domain, and we need to be able to understand that far better if we're also going to be able to understand how we protect the information going forward in this type of space. We're beginning to look this year as well at another resilience demonstrator, which is around coastal erosion, and this will allow us to start bringing in different types of sensor data. We're also looking at working with the National Robotarium around how we bring in data from robotics, doing more in detailed investigation at sites at particular areas on something called the Military Road, which is around the south of the island. And they've got real issues in some places. The road is within 5 meters of the edge, and they're anticipating potentially maximum of 7 years before the road disappears, or part of the road disappears into the sea. So actually, how can we better use information and modelling of that information from a lot of different sources, bringing that information together, modelling it, be able to start looking at possible options and impacts of those options as well. So that's something that we will be beginning to look at this year, and we'll be bringing together. And it'll be interesting as well, I think, to start looking at what sort of information we already have, what additional sorts of information do we need to be able to gather when we start looking at different resilience issues. So this, I suppose, the resilience demos are looking far less at sort of policy, much more about immediate decision making or planning decision making. So slightly less policy related. So looking at the, again, slightly different application of these types of technologies and how do they drive value in those spaces. And the other one that we are starting to look at this year, so ramping up the complexity of the sorts of systems that we are looking at, is to start looking at the energy system on the island. And the Isle of Wight have an ambition to be self-sustaining in terms of energy in the future. So starting to look at, well, what does that mean? Is that achievable? So looking at the sorts of measures that they would want to implement, well, actually, how close does that get them? And what sort of other things do they need to be considering? How can they understand usage, looking at balancing demand, etc. So as I say, that really is like starting to ramp up the complexity of the types of things that you are starting to be able to bring together, and looking at that relation into decision making and policy as well, all sorts of policies that the island needs to have in place to be able to start responding to that requirement. So really that's, hopefully has been of use, of interest. Very interested obviously in engaging with anybody and talking to anybody about, what we're doing, and if anybody's interested in getting more involved, we're obviously very willing to speak to people about that. I think it's hopefully it's something that you see as an exciting project going forward, and something that will really be, as I say, driving benefit, not only in the long term, but really looking at that sort of immediate value, not only from particularly within the demonstration program, benefit to the community and to businesses on the Isle of Wight, and being able to show that to people, the sorts of benefit this brings, but also in the creation of assets that we will then be able to start testing, refining, taking feedback on, and then releasing for others to be able to start using in this space, because I think that's also really important, that we are generating assets that people can pick up and utilize. So on that, I will hand back, I think, probably to Ian. Thank you very much.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Alex.